My name is Matt Buehler, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about why did the Arab Spring miss the Maghreb, continuity through co-optation in Morocco and Mauritania. So here in Doha for this year, I'm working on a book manuscript that looks at the success and failure of opposition alliances between leftists and Islamists in these three countries. But today we're going to talk about a little bit broader project. This is a culmination of over a year and a half of fieldwork in these three countries. I conducted over 100 interviews with different politicians, including the current Prime Minister of Morocco, Abdullah Ben Kiran. So let's begin. To start off, a quick question for the audience. These are the four Arab regimes that didn't survive the Arab Spring, the unrest of 2011, 2012. What's a commonality among them? Any thoughts? Anyone? Secular governments. Any other ideas? Sir? Autocrats, of course. Any more?
Republics?
They're all republics. So the main idea, yes, they're all republics. If we think about the Arab world being divided into two different types of states, we have presidencies and non-presidencies, mostly monarchies. We can think about Qatar or Jordan as being examples of monarchies. So what we know from the Arab Spring is that monarchies seem to persist longer than non-monarchies. And this has become a theory known as the monarchical exception thesis. So if you think that the big question is, under what conditions did an Arab regime survive the Arab Spring? The popular hot answer these days among many scholars and policymakers is that if it was a monarchy, if it was ruled by a king, then it seemed to persist better, to survive better than non-monarchies. So in my research, I really examined this thesis through looking at Morocco and Mauritania. Now, of course, this is only a comparison of two states, so it doesn't explain, say, the entire pattern of continuity or change within the region. But I think by looking at these two countries really in depth, that it helps to reveal things that you might otherwise not see. But in the back of your mind, we should also always be thinking about Tunisia, because Tunisia is where the revolution was the most successful, or these uprisings were the most successful in bringing about democratization. So really, we're thinking about Morocco and Mauritania, two very, very different states, and how did they follow similar pathways to regime resilience? Oh, pardon me. So a quick little background on these two states. So in Morocco and Mauritania, unrest began in February 2011 in both states. In Morocco, it rallied around the movement, the February 20th Movement for Change, that was led by a Che Guevara type figure known as Osama El Khalifi. He was known as the Che of Saleh. And this movement organized a series of protests in 53 different Moroccan cities. Some of them grew quite large, especially in Rabat and Casablanca, but in general they were non-violent. But in some particular small cities like Hoceima, Larache, Tangier, they became violent. In Hoceima, for example, 5 people died, 33 public buildings were destroyed. Now, in February, in Mauritania, we saw a parallel movement develop, the February 25th Movement for Change. So in Mauritania, protests were very small. They started with only 2,000 people in February 2011, but by July 2012, they grew quite large, over 90,000 people. Now, 90,000 people, doesn't seem that large compared to Egypt or Tunisia. But in Mauritania, you only have 3.7 million people. So that makes up almost 2% of the population. But what we know about these countries is even though they had this protest, they were able to survive the Arab Spring. How might we go about explaining this? So maybe you might think it has something to do with monarchy, monarchical institutions. There are many different reasons why people might say, okay, monarchies are more resilient because they're more closely associated with Islam. There's this theory that says, that Arab citizens will be less likely to resist monarchies because they're kind of more natural to Arab culture than non-monarchies. There's another theory that says monarchies are better at implementing top-down reform, right? They kind of implement reforms to forestall potential opposition to the rule in ways that presidencies do not. Now, if we look at Morocco and Mauritania, we see that Morocco is really the archetype of monarchies. The ruler Mohammed VI is very closely associated with Islam through Amir al-Mu'mineen, saying that he's the prince of believers. He's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also he's known to promote top-down reform. After the protests happened, he organized new legislative elections that occurred in November 2011. He organized a new constitution as well. In contrast, Mahmoud Abdelaziz, the president of Mauritania, is not particularly close. I mean, of course, he's a Muslim, but doesn't have a legacy, a historical relationship with Islam. He's not known to be a beacon of reform. In fact, only about a month ago, he organized new legislative elections, which was very, very late in the process. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter, right? I mean, these two regimes, even though one was a monarchy and one was not a monarchy, the outcome was the same. Both regimes survived the Arab Spring. Thus, we cannot conclude that this played a very key difference in driving this outcome. Another theory has to do with natural resource wealth, often oil or gold or copper, other types of wealth that make regimes that give regimes a tremendous amount of resources to buy off the opposition. You might think in many of the Arab Gulf countries, that's what helped, say, the UAE or Qatar forestall opposition, is that they were able to provide resources to the citizens to kind of dilute any potential opposition. In Mauritania recently, they have discovered oil. They've also discovered gold as well as uranium deposits. Morocco, by contrast, is a relatively poor state in terms of its natural endowments. There are some phosphate reserves, but nothing really to the level that we've seen in Mauritania. But again, the outcome was the same, that both regimes survived the Arab Spring. Thus, we can't say that oil was very, very important to driving this outcome. Military loyalty. From Tunisia, we know that the military's likelihood to defect from the regime helped to bring about the collapse of Ben Ali's rule. In Mauritania, over the last 30 years, the military has been very loyal to the Moroccan monarchy. In Mauritania, by contrast, there's a very long history of military coups. Every single Mauritanian president has been ousted by a coup. In October 2012, they nearly assassinated Mohammed Abdelaziz. So in these two countries, there's a very different level of military loyalty, and yet they still both survived the Arab Spring. Ethnic integration. Does it have something to do with ethnic minorities? In some Arab countries, maybe in Bahrain, in Syria, we might think marginalized ethnic minorities seized the opportunity of the Arab Spring to assert their demands, which made protests more potent. In Morocco and Mauritania, you have two different marginalized ethnic groups. You have the Amazigh, the Berber in Morocco, and in Mauritania you have the Haratin, who are essentially descendants. They're Arabs in terms of culture, but they're descendants of former black African slaves. So in Morocco, the regime has been very effective at integrating the Amazigh into society. They've made Amazigh, the language of the Amazigh, an official language. Amazigh elites have married into the royal family. In Mauritania, slavery still persists, right? It's still an active institution in Mauritanian society. So we can't say, okay, and the outcome, of course, is the regime survived. So we can't say that ethnic integration was a very important factor in driving this process. So, of course, the lingering question on all of your minds, what is the commonality in Morocco and Mauritania's strategies of survival? Oh, pardon me. So my basic argument is that these two regimes employed a very crafty, robust strategy of co-optation, which they used to build certain political parties, pro-regime political parties, in the era before the Arab Spring, and then they deployed these political parties in order to undermine the chief political beneficiaries of the unrest, specifically youth and Islamist movements. So in Morocco, the regime created the Party of Authenticity and Modernity, Hizb al-Asala wa Mu'asara, which was founded by Fouad Ali al-Himma, the very best friend of the king and the former interior minister. In Mauritania, they created the Hizb al-Ittihad min Ajl al-Jamhuriyya, the Union for the Republic Party, that was the personal party of Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz. So co-optation, what exactly does that mean? How does that work? It's a very ambiguous concept. How do we define it? How do we measure it? To measure this, just taking Morocco as one example, I developed a list of candidates, statistics about different local candidates in Morocco and Mauritania, about 2,400 candidates, and I showed when a candidate was a member of an opposition party or an independent candidate and was essentially absorbed into pro-regime parties, right? Co-opted into this pro-regime party. I have the same type of statistics for Mauritania. And then I could run a series of statistical tests to show what kind of factors are associated with this process. Was this process occurring, say, more in the city than the countryside? Was it occurring in Amazigh areas or Arab areas? Was it occurring in poor areas or rich areas? Right? These are the kind of things I can test for. And the results of the test said that basically co-optation occurs more frequently against these local politicians in rural, wealthier districts where residents have higher than average illiteracy rates. So what does this mean? This is all kind of very broad, difficult to understand. Take a little trip with me to Morocco. Imagine yourself in Morocco. What would this idealized candidate who has been co-opted look like? Maybe, he's in kind of a rural area, maybe in the mountains, in the plain. He's in a district that is relatively better off than its neighbors. And finally, he represents constituents that are maybe less politically sophisticated than others. Maybe they value material possessions more than a specific ideology, ideological preferences. Here, just as a side note, this is a picture of Fouad Ali al-Himma, the best friend of the king. So we really need to look at some specific examples to understand how this works. So here, this is in Mauritania here. This is one example of a rural mayor, Solmo Sodimba, who is the mayor of Kaidi. I interviewed Mayor Simba, and he said to me, look, in 2006, I was an independent candidate. I could get nothing from my district. I could do nothing to help my constituents. As soon as he decided to join the pro-regime party, he was able to build a new stadium, new roads, and basically what he said to me is that in Mauritania, the money comes from the power. You cooperate with the power or you don't get anything. So he's been able to more effectively serve his constituents by working with the regime. In Morocco, a similar story. Here, this is Abdul Karim Shukri, a mayor of Darboua Bouaza, an area outside of Casablanca. This is a fellow who's a member of a local aristocratic family. And what he told me is, he said, look, my family owns 2 large plantations in this area. We have about 100 peasants working for us. It's my responsibility historically to help these people, to gather resources so that they can do their agricultural, so they can farm well. And so he essentially moved from a very small regional party to this regime party in order to attract these resources to his district. So now after we understand how this co-optation works, let's think about how these strategies might be used against the opposition. So here, this is the weakening of youth movements. Here, this is a picture of Osama al-Khalifi, the Che of Saleh. And Osama al-Khalifi, the party used the exact same strategy against these local politicians as against Osama al-Khalifi. It essentially approached to him and they said, Osama, look, if you join our party, we'll give you a very good position in the elections on our electoral list for your home city of Saleh. And Khalifi, in fact, accepted the deal. This created a series of divisions within the February 20th movement, and eventually led to the the movement's collapse and its division. A similar process happened in Mauritania, where the regime party approached the members of the February 25th movement and essentially drew them into its ranks. Here, this is the weakening of Islamist movements. This picture takes a little bit of description, but here we have, this is Fouad Ali al-Himma, the guy I mentioned earlier, the leader of this other pro-regime party. And here, this is the leader of the Islamist party in Morocco, Abdelila Ben Kiran, and this is another political party leader. And basically what happened was, after the 2011 parliamentary elections, the Islamists were very successful in Morocco, in the same way that they were in Tunisia and Egypt. But because of the success of these pro-regime parties in the election, the Islamists couldn't develop a full electoral coalition on their own. And so they had to strike deals with other parties. And essentially the pro-regime party used this opportunity to foster conflict between the different political party leaders that really hurt the public impression of the Islamist party and prevented them from implementing reform. Secondly, the pro-regime party scheduled a series of protests in Rabat, in Fez, in different cities in Morocco to promote various crimes that had happened in the early 1990s that they allege the Islamists were involved in. This also hurt the reputation of the party, and in the end led to the collapse of the Islamist-led coalition in October 2013. So by way of conclusion, I want to talk about three different concepts: co-optation strategies generally, authoritarian persistence, and Arab Spring democratization. In terms of co-optation, I think this is an incredibly difficult concept to understand, to measure, to define. And I think my research, it's one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most abused terms in both public discourse, but also in academia. Everyone says, oh, this person is co-opted. Oh, this person is co-opted. Oh, this party is co-opted. But what kind of evidence can you really generate to show that it is or is not happening? How can you judge different parties' levels of co-optability, if you will? And I think my research starts to get at that. Secondly, in terms of persistence, there's a big debate right now, as I said earlier, about monarchies and presidencies. Really focusing on the differences between these different formal institutions. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you go back to the post-colonial period, Morocco and Mauritania share a history of that. At the very beginning of their forming, they shared power with rural elites, and they brought them into their coalition of control. In contrast, in Tunisia, the rural elites were really displaced, and there was an urban bias in terms of the way the regime was formed. So what made Morocco and Mauritania so persistent was their ability to monopolize the rural structures of power in order to buttress their rule during the Arab Spring. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.